I'll go ahead and start off by saying good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. My name is Caroline Sandoval. I am the Education and Outreach Manager here at the Hayward Area Historical Society. So on behalf of everyone here at HOS, we would just like to welcome you today. We are very lucky to have Rick Kelly here to talk to us about actually his new book, Rancho to Ranch Homes, which is an extensive history of Castro Valley. And he is here to talk to us today about his process, his research, especially since he spent more than 5 years researching this topic to create such a wonderful history. So without further ado, Rick, you're here to talk about your research. You've got the stage.
Thank you so much. I want to thank everybody for showing up on a Saturday to my little presentation here. It'll be about 45 minutes, and I'm hoping that most of the questions can be held towards the end. I guess you can type them in, and we'll try to get to most of them at the end of the presentation. I want to thank the Hayward Area Historical Society for providing critical support in writing the book, and of course for hosting today's presentation. In particular, especially in the early days, when I didn't know at all what I was doing, I got a lot of support from John Christian, who has since moved on, but kudos for him for helping me out in the early days. Without support from Haas, this book would have never happened, and therefore there would have been no presentation. Okay, next slide. Okay, so this turned out to be a 4-year project. It didn't start out that way. It started out to be a 2-week project, but it turned into a 4-year project, which just so happened to be timed pretty well when the pandemic arrived. I'm retired, so I didn't need to go out, couldn't do many of the activities I would normally do. And so working on historical research where I could get information from the internet and I can order stuff from libraries and archives turned out to be a good project. One of the things I really wanted to do is use the full power of the modern internet to uncover forgotten historic details, search library and historic society archives, and track down descendants of early town farmers. I figured it would be possible to track some of these folks down. Next slide. I want to start off by giving credit to the historians that came before me. I couldn't do what I've done without the work they had done in the past. Harry Bradford, John Sandoval, Dr. Marvin Smith, Grayson Yemchek, and Lucille Lorge. All were prior historians of Castro Valley, in some cases the broader area. Only Lucille is still with us. The others are all passed on, but they've left in their wake a lot of historical information I was able to take advantage of. Next slide, please. There it came in. These new photos of prior residents of Castro Valley were provided primarily by their descendants. I tracked down their grandkids, great-grandkids, and sometimes great-great-grandkids through obituaries, census records, voter registration records. Very useful, Facebook and LinkedIn in modern times to find these people. Ancestry.com, Google, and old newspaper stories. The oldest photo here dates to the 1860s. It was provided by a great-great-granddaughter. The process of finding these descendants got easier after 1950, when they finally released to the public the results of the 1950 census. Children listed in the 1950 census were much more likely to still be around than those from the 1940 census, which is the most modern one that we had until 2022. So these are all folks that used to live in Castro Valley. And actually, although the picture only dates to the 1860s, Isabel Bolton lived in Castro Valley in the 1850s. Next slide. Okay. Today's presentation is on the genesis, key resources, and a few surprising findings along the way in the process of conducting this research. This photo is one of the discoveries. This photo of Guillermo Castro, namesake of Castro Valley, and his son Luis. This is a photograph of an original 1852 daguerreotype, and it was acquired by the Bancroft Library in Berkeley in 2014. The Bancroft Library at UC Berkeley is the primary California history library, and they had inventoried it, so it was actually online in their inventory, but it hadn't been shelved. So apparently it was just sitting in a box in a back room somewhere. I contacted them through the processes that they have and said I wanted a scan of it. They said, no, we can't scan it. It hasn't been shelved yet. So actually me and John Christian kind of double teamed them and actually kind of ran a scam, but eventually forced them to give us a nice scan of the photograph. So that is the only known photograph of Guillermo Castro and his son. There may be one or two others out there, but we're not sure where those are at. It's just like there's a painting of Guillermo Castro that Haas has. And when it was discovered in 1947, there was a second painting of some of his children, which has disappeared into history after 1947. The map in the background is a superimposition of the two maps of Guillermo Castro's ranch, or Rancho in Spanish, the 1858 map and the 1864 map. And the 6 years in between were the time where Castro was fighting to get the areas that were labeled here in green added to his rancho. Of course, by the time it got approved by the government, he had already moved to South America. Next slide. My project started out to be something that would last maybe a couple of weeks. All I really wanted to do was develop a residential genealogy for the home I've lived in Castro Valley for the last 31 years, 18736 Brickell Way. I wanted to identify all prior owners of the land I live on, all the way back, ideally, if I could, to Guillermo Castro. I knew we were the sixth owners of the house because the people that sold us the house had figured that out for us. So I already kind of knew where we stood in history. But I wanted to see if I couldn't track it all the way back to Castro. Next slide. When we bought the house, it came with the blueprints. The house was originally built in 1949 for Mary and Robert O'Neill. And when I was looking at the blueprints, I noticed, you can see by the arrow there, that it was signed OK M.W. Haley. And I said, Haley, well, we live on the corner of Brickell Way and Haley Drive. Haley must have been some person, whoever this guy was, involved in the development of our neighborhood. And so I decided to, the first jump in scope of the project was to add an effort to identify the namesakes of the roads in my neighborhood here above Seven Hills Road. Brickell Way, Haley Drive, Elrod Drive, Mancini Drive, and it's not on the map, but Madison Avenue. Who were these people that lent their names to the roads where I live? Next slide. Now, I'm only going to go through this very quickly. This is the early history of Castro Valley and this area, 1797 to 1863. If you want to hear this in more detail, I'm going to take a very deep dive on this at my July 30th presentation at the Castro Valley Library, 2 to 4 o'clock. I'll spend literally 45 minutes going through this slide, which I'm going to go through in 3 minutes here today. So, but this will cover the history of Castro Valley in that era of time from 1797 to 1863, where it changed hands several different times. Of course, before the Spanish intervened, the area was occupied by Native Americans. Castro Valley was actually near the intersection of two different language groups, the so-called Bay Miwok and the more familiar, I think, most people, the Ohlone tribes. And really those names differentiate the groupings based on their languages. The two sub-tribes that lived in the Castro Valley area were the Yauquin and the Yurgan or Urgan peoples. And they lived in the Castro Valley, San Leandro, San Lorenzo area. The Bay Miwok started just at the very north end of Castro Valley, going up into what's now the parkland. Spain claimed California in the 1500s, but did nothing to colonize it until the year 1769. In that year, a group of priests and military men headed north to conquer Alta California in an assault, quote, led by the cross rather than by the sword. So they didn't have enough military folks to militarily dominate California. Their goal was to acculturate it in a method that they had used for quite a few years in South America and in different parts of the New World. They established first missions in San Diego and Monterey in that year, 1769, or I think the second one was 1770. And in 1776, added the Mission Dolores in San Francisco and Mission Santa Clara in the South Bay. Now, actually, the Mission Dolores recruited a little bit in Alameda County in the Berkeley, Oakland area. So actually, some of those Native Americans were moved over across the bay pretty early on. But the Castro Valley natives were not impacted until the Mission San Jose was built in what's today's modern Fremont in 1797. Ultimately, the Spanish would build 21 missions over a 52-year period stretching from San Diego to Sonoma. But the key one we're talking about here is the Mission San Jose, which was started in 1797. This drawing you see here of the mission is the only one I could find that shows the mission in its heyday. All the other photographs, paintings, and drawings that I could find of the mission were made after the Americans had arrived and after the mission had been in decay for years. So this shows the mission really pretty close to its peak in 1826. This image is actually a couple of images. I put it together and made it usable, but it's a couple of images from a drawing by the fellow by the name of William Smith, or Smythe, I guess what it is. And what you see that the church building, sort of in the far end in the middle, is surrounded by extensive native housing. And there's a couple of native built houses on the side there too. The idea that the Spanish had was to congregate the Native Americans around the missions, turn them into Catholics, turn them into farmers, turn them into tradesmen, and ultimately to allow the mission to turn into, the mission would disappear, the church would remain, but the mission would disappear and the community would turn into a new pueblo, tax-paying members of New Spain, which is what Alta California was in that era. They thought that it would take about 10 years for each mission to evolve into a pueblo. But over a total of 60 years in California, not one of the missions successfully evolved into a new pueblo. Yet the problem was they still had sole control over most of the best lands in California. And everything really changed in 1821 when the Mexicans were successful in kicking out the Spanish, and New Spain turned into the independent country of Mexico. Suddenly, it became possible for the ranchers and the missions to trade with the Americans, exchanging cow hides, which are used for leather, and cow fat, which are used for the all-important candles, for marked up American, European, and Chinese luxury goods. So up until 1822, everybody in Alta California was dirt poor, okay? But after 1822, everybody that had cattle, that had a rancho, that had a mission, could buy good stuff by selling the products of their rancho. But of course, the problem is there were very few privately owned ranchos at that point. So now the people of Alta California decided that it was time to get rid of the missions. And over a many-year period, they started the process of secularizing the missions, which means turning control of the missions over to the government from the priests that had been running them. And more importantly, that was considered a sort of a nuisance part of it. More importantly, making their lands available to either sell or give away to well-connected members of the community. And so that's what happened. So on November 29th, 1836, Mission San Jose was the second to last mission to be secularized. Management of the mission was turned over to the government, and a mission administrator was appointed. And all of a sudden, their lands became available for granting. Well, Guillermo Castro and his father, Carlos Castro, wasted no time. 3 weeks after the land was secularized, they applied for a land grant in Rancho San Leandro. Got to keep my L's, Leandro, Lorenzo straight. It's confusing. They actually applied for a grant in Rancho San Leandro. Of course, at the same time, Estudillo applied for a grant in Rancho San Leandro. So those guys had to fight it out. A little bit later, Carlos and Guillermo applied for just a small grant to build a house in Rancho San Lorenzo, and they got 60 acres, so a very small lot by that era, in what is now downtown Hayward, which is where Castro built his adobe. They then, with a toehold in Rancho San Lorenzo, they asked for a huge grant in Rancho San Lorenzo. The problem was, of course, that Soto had Francisco Soto had already applied for Rancho San Lorenzo. So now Castro had to fight with his neighbors, and that process actually lasted 5 or 6 years. Actually, it lasted longer than that, but it was because of that conflict and other reasons. Nobody got any grants for 5 years, and Castro didn't get his grant for 6 years. So the common idea that Castro was a good guy, he was a good soldier, well connected, and he asked for a grant and he got it. It was much more complicated than that. It took 6 years. Anyway, Castro only enjoyed his grant. He got it in 1843. He only enjoyed it for a few years before the Americans arrived. And then it was fine for a little while. The gold rushers drove up the price of his cattle from $4 per cow to $60 per cow. But of course, shortly thereafter, squatters started showing up on his land, started stealing his cattle, cutting down his trees. And there's a whole host of things that led to Castro ultimately in 1863 throwing in the towel and selling off the Rancho to Faxendine Atherton, namesake of Atherton, California. Now, there's I cover in the book in significant detail the errors in history that relate to the sale of Castro's Rancho, and virtually everything you'll read is incorrect in one way or another. In fact, the records are kept in Alameda County Recorder's Office. Castro, in February of 1863, sold his rancho for $130,000 in cash and forgiveness of $70,000 worth of loans. So the net value to Castro was about $200,000. So when Castro sailed either that year or in 1864 for South America, he left with $130,000 in his pocket, which is equivalent to something like $3 million today. So the concept that he left as a loser or as a pauper doesn't match up with his $3 million that he left with. Anyway, Faxendine Atherton promptly hired his nephew, Charles Ward, to manage the rancho. And Ward had many tasks. His main task was to kick out the squatters, either convert them into renters or buyers, and to essentially make money for Faxendine Atherton. So that's the quick version of the early Castro Valley history, 1797 to 1863. Next slide. When you start looking at history, one of the first things I soon found was this second official map of Alameda County, California. Remember, my original goal is to find information on my neighborhood. And this is the second official map ever published. There was one before this, 4 years before, but it has a lot of errors. This is a so-called cadastral map, which is defined as a map that shows the names of major property holders. Right about where I live, you can see that there's a large farm owned by J.G. Brickles, a name that sounds a lot like the road I live on, Brickell Way. Remember, my address is 18736 Brickell Way. I figure Brickles, well, that might be the guy I'm looking for. So if you look at the top right, the map at the top right, I superimposed the Brickell Farm from 1878 on the modern map. And sure enough, you see my neighborhood, Elrod Drive, Haley Drive, Mancini Drive, Brickell Way, is at the northeast corner of the Brickell Farm. And that rectangle was the Brickell house. It looks like it's on Elrod Drive, but Elrod Drive didn't exist in that era. It was actually on what's now called Sandy Road. Sandy Road was the original farm route. And those little circles you see around the house were his orchard. Brickell had started to convert from growing grains to growing fruit, which all of Castro Valley was doing starting about the mid-1870s. And by the mid-1880s, pretty much all the properties along Redwood Road and some of the other properties as well, I converted to growing fruit. This was a microcosm of all of California. All of California made that transition. Next slide. You know, I got lucky. Just before I really got started on this project, an entire book was published detailing the life of Edward J. Brickell, Josiah's older brother. So that was incredibly helpful. After he came to the gold rush, Ed Brickell returned to California in 1851 with his wife and kids and two other older brothers. And they all settled in what was called Illinois Town at the time, is now called Colfax. Later on, they moved up the hill to, they moved up the hill to, I can't remember the name of the place, but they lived there for many years. In fact, there's an area called Brickletown up there that's named after Edward J. Brickell. Ed became very wealthy lumbering, and later he moved to Spokane, which was then called Spokane Falls, and helped found that town. Using this book, I was able to see that Josiah Brickell's ancestors had been in the United States since as far back as before there was a United States. His great-great-grandfather, the Reverend Matthias Brickell, immigrated to North Carolina in 1724. An offshoot of the Brickell family actually founded Miami, Florida. Several of his brothers came out and lived with him up in Sacramento and in the foothills. His brother Barzilla Brickell was killed in a gunfight in Sacramento in 1855 with the lover of his 15-year-old daughter, who was appropriately named, very Western-sounding name, Sam Garrett. So Sam Garrett shot Barzilla Brickell down. Sam was convicted, was jailed on a prison ship on the Sacramento River, convicted, and he was scheduled to be hanged. And Brickell's daughter married him 5 days before he was hung. So it made an interesting story. All right, next slide. This is the first existent map that shows where Brickell was in 1865. It turns out the county put all of their old maps online in 2016. Really, that was the discovery of the old county maps was what made this project possible. I probably would have never proceeded if this hadn't happened. This is the earliest map. This is County Survey 663. So it's the 663rd survey ever taken by Alameda County. And the road that runs north-south here is Redwood Road. And you can see that Atherton, he still owns a lot of the land along Redwood Road. And there we see Brickell, again, misspelled in the middle, just south of Kelly, just south of Dan Proctor up to the north. And it turns out that Josiah Brickell came to California from Michigan in 1854 at the age of 22. And he, like everybody else, dug for gold for a few months. And how do we know that? It's spelled out in his 1880 obituary, which John Christian was able to dig out of the Hayward Journal. He returned to the East Bay in 1855. We know that because it's in the 1876 county history book. He squatted in Castro Valley north of the farm of Dan Proctor. So he did not squat where he's shown in this map. He squatted north of the Dan Proctor claim. How do we know that? It says so in the 1864 sales deed to Proctor from Atherton. He married in 1857 to Bridget Condren. He moved to the farm shown here in this map sometime after 1863, when the squatter who had been living there, Richard Dowling Sr., was killed by a kick from his horse. And we have all that information from the 1865 sales contract and estate paperwork and Richard Dowling's death. Actually, Richard Dowling made the paper a few times. His death was reported in the newspaper in 1863. His son, also named Richard Dowling, later shot his hand off with a shotgun while hunting gophers, and that's how he died. So it's sort of a hard luck family. Any case, so Brickell moved down to that site, probably buying the squatter's claim. Squatter's claims were registered, bought, and sold, just like deed. But of course, when Atherton sent his man up there, he attempted to get Brickell to go ahead and actually buy the farm or get out. Next slide. Again, luck shown on me. I went over to the California Historical Society, and in the Atherton collection, they had one sale contract of sale for Rancho San Lorenzo in Castro Valley. They had several for Hayward, but only one for Castro Valley, and it was to Josiah Grover Brickell, believe it or not. So in November 1st, 1864, Atherton, or more likely his man Ward, approached Brickell to offer him to buy the land. That date, November 1st, 1864, is kind of relevant. That was the day that the Rancho map got the final judicial sign-off as being official. Now, it wasn't really official until the next year, but it was signed off that day. So maybe that's the reason that Ward went up there and tried to get Brickell to sign the contract. Brickell refused to sign the contract. He did sign about 8 months later, after the Rancho had been patented, which means that the U.S. government had declared absolutely, without doubt, that Castro had owned the land and therefore Atherton owned the land. So at that point, Brickell agreed to pay $35 an acre, which was a relatively high price, but this was a well-developed property. It had been substantially developed by the prior squatter. So a total of $6,077.74, 3-year mortgage at 1% interest per month, which was pretty standard in those days. He was supposed to pay it off in 3 years, but it took him 5 years, and he ended up paying it off on November 25th, 1870. Remember that date, November 25th, 1870. Josiah and Bridget raised their 3 daughters on their farm, Mary, Lydia, and Hannah, and Josiah and Bridget lived there for their entire lives. Josiah died in 1880, Bridget died in 1886, as we'll see further on. So I was very lucky yet again to find the actual contract of sale to Josiah Brickell. I would have liked to find some more, but I was glad to find that one. Next slide. So when you research Castro Valley history and you put Brickell and Castro Valley, Josiah Brickell and Castro Valley into Google, you come up with the fact that there is a historical plaque in Castro Valley on a school now run by the Christian school that says that this was the site of the first public school in Castro Valley history. The plaque reads, "The site was part of the original Don Castro land grant." Well, all of Castro Valley was part of the original Don Castro land grant. In 1866, pioneer settler Josiah Grover Brickell made a land grant of this site for educational purposes only and paid the teacher's salary who taught children by day in the one-room schoolhouse and the farm hands at night by candlelight. This is California Registered Historic Landmark number 776, and the plaque was placed by the California State Historic Commission in cooperation with the Vallecito Parlor number 308 Native Daughters of the Golden West on November 25th, 1962. So you recognize that they placed the plaque on the anniversary of Brickell getting the deed to the land. On the left side, we see a photo of that schoolhouse, the Redwood Schoolhouse or the Castro Valley Schoolhouse. This was the class photo from 1894. Remarkably, several of the girls in this photo were actually present in 1962 when they put up the commemorative plaque. The teacher you see standing in the back, the male teacher you see standing in the back, he comes up a little bit later. So that was Bertine Proctor. So son of Josiah, or son of Proctor, who lived just north of Brickell, north of Kelly and Brickell. So we'll talk about that later. So it must be true because it's an official California historic landmark. Well, let's dig into that a little bit. So it turns out the entire landmark designation was based on the memory of Josiah and Bridget's granddaughter, Alma Brickell Hoare Eggert. So Hannah Hoare, that's her married name, Hannah Brickell Hoare, and that is how you pronounce it. I had to figure that out. That's a photograph of her from the 1920s. That's her husband from the 1920s, Peter Hoare. And they, for a long time, up until I think 1929, they lived on their land in Castro Valley. And she told the story to Alma. Alma, by the way, is the namesake of Alma Avenue in Castro Valley. And Alma used that story to justify the historic plaque. Now, Alma, all of them lived in their new house. You see in the top photo, that was the new house they built, which is located where today you'll find the Castro Valley Unified School District offices and the adult school. And the photo on the bottom is a long shot of their property as well as another property on the left. And you can see by that point, everybody had transitioned to growing fruit trees. These photos were taken in 1905. And by 1905, everybody had transitioned to growing fruit trees. Yeah, next slide. I'm falling behind on the next slide here. Next slide. Yeah, I'm working off of two sets of slides here, so I gotta pay attention. So yeah, top photo is their new house that they built in 1898. Bottom is the long shot of their new house, and on the right we see a current map of the Brickell farm, which shows the original Hoare house site, which was the original Brickell house site. My house nearby. Below that's the Kerwin home. That's the home of Mary Kerwin. After she was Mary Brickell, she married a Kerwin, and they lived down there. And you can see where the new house was built, right, not too far from the Redwood School and right by the Castro Valley Unified School District. I'll try to keep up with the slides. Next slide. Okay, so I emailed the state and I said, please send me the file that you have that justify the historical landmark designation. And it turns out that virtually every statement in support of the application is demonstrably wrong. The application said the school opened in 1866. There's no record of its existence until 1873. The application said Brickell arrived in Castro Valley in 1848. He was a farmer in Michigan, as detailed in the 1850 census. There were no Americans in Castro Valley in 1848. There were almost no Americans in the East Bay. There were a handful of people, but they lived all down by the mission. Said Brickell was from Ireland, as we've already seen. He was born in Indiana and grew up in Michigan. He said Brickell made a grant of land with the restriction that it was to be used for educational purposes only. He did not, and nor did his daughter Hannah or Mary, who owned the land from 1886 to 1902, and we'll talk about that later on. It says Josiah sent to Ireland for his bride in 1854. Well, I can't prove that's not true, but it's not likely since he was from Michigan. I don't know how many women he knew in Ireland. They weren't married until 1857, so that was a pretty slow boat, even by the metrics of that time. The application said Bert Proctor, who we saw in the picture, taught Brickell daughters. Well, in fact, Bert Proctor couldn't have started teaching in the Castro Valley School until at least 1882, and by that point, all of the Brickell daughters had graduated from school. and said Brickell's mules were used to build Lake Chabot. Well, he didn't really have any mules. In fact, the first schoolhouse in Castro Valley, it was not. It was either the second schoolhouse or the sixth schoolhouse, depending upon how you count, depending upon how you define Castro Valley. So essentially, all the justifications for designating that as the first schoolhouse in Castro Valley are incorrect. Next slide. Here we see in the Oakland and Alameda County directory for the year 1870, and what I've excerpted are all the schools in Eden Township, which includes this whole area, in 1866, 67, and 68. And the only schools were the Edenvale School, the Eureka School, the Laurel School, the Palmyra School, we now call Palomares, San Lorenzo, and the Union School. There was no Castro Valley in 1866, 67, 68, or 69. Down below, we see something from the Office of the Comptroller of the State. And basically, it lists the number of students per school district in Alameda County. It's a little hard to read, but in 1872, there's no listing for Castro Valley. In 1874, all of a sudden, you have a listing for the Castro Valley School, which had 51 students at that time. So the record is very clear that the public school, Castro Valley School, didn't exist until 1873. Now, maybe it was a private school. Maybe, they said that Brickell paid the teacher, so that suggests maybe it was a private school, even though the plaque said it was a public school. Well, I have the 1867 map of Redwood Road here, and that lists all of the occupants, all the farmers along the road, and it shows all the buildings along the road. It shows the Jameson House, it shows the Duncan Cameron Kennedy House. But if you look on the Brickell property, which is where the school was, there's no building shown. Now, the other farmhouses were further inland, so they don't show up on this map. But if there had been a school there, it absolutely would have been plotted, and it wasn't plotted. So this makes it, impossible that there was a private school at that site. Keep in mind, they claimed that he donated the land in 1866. He didn't own the land until 1870. So it's unlikely, not impossible, but unlikely that he could have donated the land in 1866. So all of that appears to be apocryphal based on family tales passed down in the Hoare family. Next slide. Okay, the first school in Castro Valley was actually called the Edenvale School. And it was built by the gold rusher turned super squatter, Reverend Zachariah Hughes, and his neighbors, William Maddox and Robert Farley in 1855. So this was an era when the only people around were squatters. Nobody had purchased any land other than Hayward himself, who bought land in Hayward. William Hayward bought land in Hayward in 1854. Nobody else had purchased land. So everybody involved was a squatter. In fact, Hughes and his two stepsons, let me just make an adjustment here. Okay. Hughes and his two stepsons, James and John Williams, had squatted the entire length of the west side of Redwood Road, right after Redwood Road was built. The construction of Redwood Road was to facilitate hauling redwood lumber out from behind Oakland. They had the big redwood trees up there in those days, and we still have some. And that road was built in 1852 to make it possible to haul redwood lumber down and get it to the bay for shipment to San Francisco. That meant, boom, people could show up in Castro Valley and squat. And Zachariah Hughes and his two stepsons took up all the way from the high school almost down to Hayward on the west side of Redwood Road. Very quickly, a matter of weeks later, people showed up. Richard Dowling Jr. showed up, and another fellow named Abel showed up, and they squatted on the whole eastern side of Redwood Road. So in a matter of months after the road was opened, Castro Valley was pretty much along Redwood Road anyway, was fully squatted. Hughes finally bought all three claims all at one time from Castro in 1856 for $25 an acre. That was a pretty good price. Of course, it was pretty raw land in those days. And you see the map. On the map, it's a little hard to make out, but you see the school district, the high school at the top, Redwood Road at right. The red freeway goes down the middle, and at the bottom we have we're getting down to the Knox track down below. Grove Way is near the bottom. And at the bottom of the map, that's the 1856 map superimposed with the modern map, is a little building. That was Zachariah Hughes' Edenvale School that he and his neighbors built in 1855. And it was a public school. It was partially publicly funded. So that was actually the first school in Castro Valley. The people who lived in Hayward really wanted that school, and they tried to convince Hughes to move it to Hayward. He wouldn't do it. So on July 4th, 1864, they just stole it under cover of night, and probably with all the fireworks going off. They went across the Castro Valley, stole the school, and plopped it down in Hayward, and that's where it stayed after that. And there were no other schools in Castro Valley until 1873, when the school opened in Castro Valley. Mind you, the school, when it was in Hayward, continued to service Castro Valley students. Next slide. So who deeded the land to the school with the restriction on educational uses only? Well, it turned out that was deeded by Martin J. Madison, who's also the namesake of Madison Avenue in my neighborhood. Martin Madison was a son of a wealthy businessman. They made most of their money by shipping lumber. They were ship merchants, and most of the money was made by shipping lumber back from Northern California, from Oregon, all around the Pacific, actually. He all of a sudden moved to town. So he lived in San Francisco his whole life. His father had gone to San Francisco in 1852, and he bought a 6-acre lot on Redwood Road, which is shown on the map on the bottom left. County Road 663, that's Redwood Road running north-south. County Road 248 across the bottom, that's what we now call Castro Valley Boulevard. So just a little ways up from there, Madison bought a 6-acre lot and was one of the absolute founders of the chicken era in Castro Valley. Now, this was not unusual. Starting in the 1880s, Castro Valley had become a center for well-to-do guys to build either retirement homes, summer homes, or permanent homes in the country. In other words, if you lived in Oakland or San Francisco and you wanted a home in the country where your family could hang out in summer and you could visit, very often that would be built in Castro Valley. And so Madison was part of that wave of people that arrived in town. He wanted to expand his operation, so in 1902 he purchased the southern half of the old Brickell farm from Mary Brickell Kerwin. And again, he ultimately lent his name to Madison Avenue when it was built in 1927. He was elected as a school trustee in 1903, only appropriate since he owned the land that the school sat on. And he was the one in 1903 who finally deeded the Castro Valley School the land that it sat on, and included in the deed the restriction that the land will be used for educational purposes only. So that's where that came from. It had nothing to do with Brickell or even Brickell's daughter. It came from Martin Madison. Now, the concept of building the school without deeding the land is not that unusual. The same thing happened at the Palomares School, and that ran into some trouble at one point too. Now, it turns out that his father, Martin Madison's father, Bennett Madison, his real name was Bennett Madsen, but everybody couldn't pronounce it, so he ultimately went with Bennett Madison. He moved to town in Hayward, and he built this large mansion on what was then called Castro Boulevard, now called Mission Boulevard. And that big house, which is in the middle of the photo of the drawing at the top, is still there. It's been an 18-unit apartment building since 1943. It's still there. It was an unfortunate choice, I guess, because Bennett Madison was murdered by a person he associated with in that house in 1911. One of just many bad things that happened to the Madison family. Okay, next slide. The original one-room school was replaced by a 4-room school that you see here in 1905, which burned down in 1920. The original site on Redwood Road was abandoned for a new site in the center of town, which you see in the top right. That was the Castro Valley School along Castro Valley Boulevard in the center of town. Ultimately, that school had to be demolished due to not being seismically secured. Madison actually threatened to sue to get his land back because it wasn't being used for school purposes. Eventually, they did build a new school there called the Redwood School in 1949. There's a photo of it from the 1962 application for the historical designation. That's now run by the Redwood Chapel, but it's still a school as required by the deed. Next slide. As I said, one of the big breakthroughs was me discovering that Alameda County had put all of their maps online. This made it possible for me to figure out who these guys, Elrod, Haley, and Mancini, were that had their names on my neighborhood. They had maps, all these maps in Castro Valley, dating back to 1853, which was when Alameda County was carved out of Santa Clara and Contra Costa County. Turned out to be an untapped gold mine of historic information, and it's hosted by the Alameda County Public Works Agency survey documents. The actual website looks different now. Doesn't work as well as it used to, as far as I can tell, but tens of thousands of maps are in there, ready to be perused. Next slide. I found the whole history of the part of the Brickell farm where I lived from 1885 to 1947 in one spot, in one document on this website. And actually, I'm having, let me see if I can move this a little bit. Yes, I can. Okay. As I already said, Josiah Brickell died in 1880 from cholera morbus, which is not a real thing. It's not cholera that we think of. It just means bad intestinal problems, whatever that might be. So he was dead in 1880, and Bridget had to run the farm after that. She deeded 36 acres to her daughter Lydia in 1885. Lydia was the first daughter to marry, and as a wedding gift, she deeded the new couple 36 acres in the northwest part of the farm. Bridget developed what appears to be cancer, and she deeded the remaining farm, 137 acres, to unmarried daughters Hannah and Mary in 1886, just before she died, a matter of weeks before she died. She surely remembered the year-long effort that she had to go through after Josiah died, but she didn't want her daughters to have to do that. So she deeded the farm to the two girls, undivided, just before she died in 1886. The daughters tried to sell it, but not being able to sell it, they eventually both got married to farmers, and they split up the land with Hannah taking the north part and Mary taking the south part, and set about farming it. Okay. Hannah Brickell, who was Hannah Hoare after she was married, kept the part where I live until 1948 when she sold it for subdivision. So boom, here we have the connection all the way from Faxon Atherton through Josiah Brickell, through Bridget Brickell, to the two daughters, and finally to Hannah Brickell before she sold it for subdivision in 1948. So in one page, I got all that information. Next slide. And another page in the final subdivision plan, which I got from the Alameda County Survey, I learned that Hannah C. Hoare, her middle name was actually Catherine, sold the property to Marlon W. Haley. So here was the M.W. Haley that signed the blueprints by the O'Neills who were building my house. So now I knew who, at least I had the name, who Marlon Haley was. It was dated February 19th, 1948. Turns out that's an important date, and recorded just a couple of days after that. And then there's also a signature by the engineer on the project. The engineer's name was John A. Mancini. Turned out to be John Adolph Mancini. Boom. There's the name for Mancini Drive in my neighborhood. And also, if you go back to the prior, can you go back to the prior slide just a little bit? At the bottom of this preliminary subdivision plan, it's signed by J.R. Elrod, which is John Richard Elrod. He is the namesake of Elrod Drive in my neighborhood. Next slide. And you see the photo on the left was taken in late 1949. That is my neighborhood under construction. Just below that is Alameda Track 733, which was pretty much complete by that point. You can see there was about 8 or 9 houses built. The one with the arrow, a little hard to see, but with the arrow, that's my house. That was one of the first houses built in the neighborhood. So the namesakes of the roads were Marlon Wallace Haley, who was the developer, John Adolph Mancini, who was the engineer, and John Richard Elrod, who was the real estate guy. He would sell the lots, and he would arrange for houses to be built, because all these were custom houses, which was getting to be relatively rare in that era, but this was still built in that way back in the day. It's great that we have a photograph right when there were just a few houses being built. And that's from historicmapworks.com. There's several sites on the internet where you can get these aerial photos going back as far as 1931 in Castro Valley. Next slide. So let's talk a little bit about Marlon Wallace Haley. Okay, Haley was an attorney trained at Hastings, and he practiced in Hayward. He was actually a very important, influential guy in the history of this area. And you know, if you read in the book, he comes up over and over and over again, not just in association with Castro Valley, but really all of Alameda County south of Oakland. He comes up over and over and over again. His bio from 1964 is presented on the right. He was appointed to the board of the East Bay Regional Park District. So he was a director of the East Bay Park District from 64 to, I believe, 74. He was ultimately the president of the Park District. And you can see he was a very accomplished guy. And the cool thing about him is, you know, his father was William Wallace Haley. They loved to name the kids William Wallace. But they couldn't do that because His mother's maiden name was Marlin, and Marlin was a very famous name in the history of this part of Alameda County, as was Haley. So next slide, please. It turns out that Marlin Haley's ancestors were all 49ers who came to California for the gold rush in 1949, and they all stayed, and they were all tremendously successful. So the drawing at the left, which was made in 1878, was the home and farm of Caleb S. Haley, who was Marlin Haley's granduncle. That was down in the Newark area. Below on the right is a drawing of Ebenezer Haley. And Ebenezer Haley was Marlin Haley's paternal great-grandfather. Okay, so on his father's side, he traced back all the way to these very successful 49ers. The big drawing at the bottom left is the San Lorenzo farm of John Marlin. John Marlin was one of the most successful squatters turned farmers in what's now generally called San Lorenzo. He showed up very early on, and he ultimately settled on the farm you see in the picture. On the left-hand side, you see the train going down the Central Pacific Railroad track. On the right-hand side, you see the road to Alvarado, which we now call Hesperian Boulevard. Okay, so he had a very substantial farm. And as you can see, this being 1878, he, like everybody else, had transitioned to growing fruit trees. So Haley's ancestors were all 49ers, which is pretty extraordinary turn of events. Next slide. Dick Elrod had a little bit different story. He was born in North Carolina in 1842. His family moved to San Francisco sometime a little bit before 1900. His parents either separated or got divorced in the 1900 census. They were living separately. Haley trained as a carpenter, and he took advantage after the great earthquake and fire in San Francisco. He immediately moved across to Berkeley, where he joined up with his brother Charles and formed a building contracting company. And he also went into selling land, selling real estate. He would buy properties and try to sell them. He was a big mover and shaker for a little while, but he went bankrupt in 1914. So that didn't work out too well. He turned to selling autos, and that was difficult in those days because you would sign on for one auto company and they'd go out of business the next year. So he bounced around. Finally, he was selling cars in Berkeley for the Hudson Essex lines in a building that still exists in Berkeley. And he was very successful there, selling 100 cars in 1 year in Berkeley. But then after the war, real estate picked up as we entered the roaring 20s, a time of much money being spent and much speculation. And he returned to building real estate. You can see on the bottom right is an advertisement for 1926 of the show home that he built called La Chateau, which is still there and still located at 6357 Broadway Terrace. And you can go up and drive by it. That was the show house that they built. However, the whole project, which was an expensive investment, didn't work out. And once again, poor Dick Elrod ended up bankrupt. After that, he bailed out of the obviously highly competitive market up in Berkeley and Oakland and moved to Colonial Acres, which is now considered to be part of Cherryland, even though it's not really part of Cherryland, but it is officially designated as part of Cherryland. And he started selling rural properties in Hayward, Cherryland, Castro Valley, particularly emphasizing Castro Valley. But you get to the end of just before the Depression, he's the primary real estate developer in Castro Valley. And during the Depression, which was obviously difficult times, he was the only one really working to subdivide farms in Castro Valley and sell properties. And then after the war, of course, things picked up dramatically. And that's when he partnered with Haley and Mancini to build my neighborhood, which was, by the way, not the first neighborhood they built as a team. They built another neighborhood along Grove Way before they built my neighborhood. Next slide. He moved into Castro Valley in 1936, and later, in about 1950, he moved up to my neighborhood, just 2 doors away from where I live now. John Adolph Mancini was the engineer on the project. Like Elrod, he lived in San Francisco. His father had immigrated from Italy to San Francisco in 1902, and he was married shortly thereafter. John was born in San Francisco in 1904. Their neighborhood was actually spared from the fire in San Francisco. They have maps that show neighborhoods that were spared, which were very few, but everything else was burned out. So the Mancini family left San Francisco after the 1906 earthquake and settled in town. And they bought a 5-acre property on Wilson Avenue, which they lived on for many, many years. One brother at least followed Attila to Castro Valley. So there, before long, there was a whole bunch of Mancinis living in Castro Valley. John was a real brainiac. He graduated as the valedictorian from the Hayward Union High School. And the Hayward Union High School in those days had all the high school students from the whole area, Castro Valley, the whole area went to the Hayward Union High School. He attended Stanford University on several scholarships, but also waited tables and tutored others to make money to be able to go there. He claims to have been on the basketball team, but I couldn't find the evidence of that. And maybe it was the JV team or something like that. And he said he had John Steinbeck as a roommate. I was unable to verify that. John Steinbeck was a student at that time at Stanford, so it's not impossible. But couldn't tell if John was making that up or if it was real. He took a job as an engineer for the city of Hayward. This was a part-time job. He continued to do other engineering work, primary surveying work, and things like that on his own. He kept that job all the way until 1947, when, under contentious and confusing circumstances, he got fired, which was just in time for him to jump into the post-war housing boom that completely transformed Castro Valley from a farming community into a suburban community. He married Doris Luce, the great-granddaughter of Castro Valley pioneers Daniel Luce and Elizabeth Cole. You'll recognize Cole from Cole Canyon. And by the time you get to the mid-50s, he was making a whole lot of money, the equivalent of $30,000 a month in modern dollars. He lived in a big house up on Jensen Road, which I wanted to look at it, but it turns out it had been replaced by a new big house up on Jensen Road. He was very attracted to women, I guess, and he went through two very lurid divorces that were covered in great detail in the newspaper, which cost him much embarrassment and much money. Both of his ex-wives said he was a heavy drinker. One of his ex-wives had an emergency button installed that would call her sister over from next door when John came home, allegedly. But his work, I mean, in the book, I go through some of the details. Half of Castro Valley was built on work done by his firm. The hospital, many of the churches, the post office, lots of neighborhoods were built by survey and engineering work done by John Adolph Mancini. Next slide. And I wanted to spend a couple of minutes talking about this. When our neighborhood was subdivided, the deeds include a bunch of deed restrictions. Number 14 was what's called a racial covenant. It read, "No person of any race other than the white Caucasian race shall use or occupy any building or any lot within said tract, except that the covenant shall not prevent occupancy by domestics or servants of a different race domiciled with a white Caucasian owner or tenant." Pretty awful stuff. But in that era, absolutely standard. It was absolutely the standard in almost all of these suburban deeds. Below that, you see an advertisement that Dick Elrod ran in the newspaper, and it starts off with A, 100% restricted district. Restricted district meant that no non-Caucasians were allowed to live there. Interestingly, in California, non-Caucasians could buy the property. They could own the house. They just couldn't live there. An interesting twist that only applied to California. The neighborhood was called Valley View Home Sites. It was 100% restricted. Now, when Haley bought the land in early 1948, it was legal to do this, and by putting this in the deed, it would run with the deed, which meant that the racial restriction would apply to everybody going forward forever. So when the next person bought the land, the next person bought the house, the next person bought the house, this racial restriction would apply to them. But a matter of weeks after Haley, who was an attorney, bought the land, the Supreme Court ruled that this was illegal, unconstitutional, and racial covenants could no longer run with the deed. You could still refuse to sell the house to non-Caucasians, but you couldn't enforce that deed on people selling the house after that. Nevertheless, even though he had to know that was the case, that the Supreme Court had ruled it unconstitutional, he still filed a deed restriction a few weeks after that because the FHA, who would give loans on the property, still enforced the requirement for deed restriction. And the main reason I bring this up is that in the deeds, we, the people that live in this neighborhood, have the opportunity every 10 years to take a vote to permanently and completely eliminate the deed restrictions. Any of them, but particularly the number 14, the racial deed restriction. And this is a year, 2023 is one of the 10-year windows where we as a neighborhood, the 150 some houses in this neighborhood, could get together and actually vote to remove it from our deeds. And we would be the only community in Castro Valley, only community in Alameda County that's done that, and perhaps the only community in all of California that's done it by that particular mechanism. Anyway, that's something I'm hoping to get together before the end of the year. Next slide. And then this is the end. This is the chain of title for my house, all the way from the Yauquin Yurgan people to the Mission San Jose, Mexican government, Guillermo Castro, Faxon Atherton, Josiah Brickell, Bridget Brickell, Mary and Hannah Brickell, after they separated the property, Hannah Brickell Hoare, Marlon Haley. Then the first house was built by Robert and Mary O'Neill. It was sold to Donald and Mabel Beckwin, Anthony and Dolores Sarawiz, I think, Terry and Suzanne Young, Howard and Catherine Newman, who sold me and my wife Kim the house in 1992, and we live there still. And I also threw in the squatter, Richard Dowling Sr., who lived there from about 1853 to 1863, when he died by being kicked by his horse. Okay, so that's that. And if there are any questions, I can address them now.
Wonderful. Well, one of the first ones that we're seeing pop up, actually, it was the most recent question. It looks like Linda Slater wanted to know, what year was the covenant shown?
What year was the covenant filed? 1948. Okay, so the land was purchased in early 1948. The use of covenants was made illegal a few weeks later, and then after that, still in 1948, the racial restriction covenant was filed, even though it was unenforceable, because people couldn't have gotten FHA loans if that hadn't been in there. So, I researched Haley, and Haley was not himself, a racist guy. He was doing what he had to, or he wouldn't be able to sell property in that era. It was that simple. That deed restriction no longer applies. It was made illegal by several actions taken by California and by the federal government in the 1960s. So obviously it doesn't apply anymore, but it's still in there, and it can't easily be erased. The best way to erase it is to actually hold a vote. And very few neighborhoods that have racial restrictions have that written into the restriction, where we can vote it out every 10 years. It's a very unusual codicil to the thing.
All right. The next question was by Phil Allen right at the beginning, and he says, I walked CV in 71 and 72, all of it, in an effort to find the town's psychological center. Any idea where it is?
Well, I'm not sure that's a question. I would, if I was going to put a psychological center, I'd put it on the Castro Adobe, which is the Adobe building built in 1938, just next to the Castro Valley School. And I think that's as good a spot as any for a psychological center.
Pete Rosen would like to know, can you tell us where your book is available for purchase? It's amazing, and thank you for doing this.
The book, I'm urging people in Castro Valley to buy the book at either of the two hardware stores in town. So the Workbench Hardware Store on Center Street or Pete's Hardware Store on Castro Valley Boulevard. It is also available on Amazon. And if you live out of town, that's what you would do. But I'm trying to support local businesses. So if you want a copy of the book and you live locally, I urge you to go to one of the two hardware stores to pick it up.
And for those interested in purchasing on Amazon, we have included the link to that in the chat field if you'd need to. But of course, we support Rick in saying shop locally before giving Amazon your dollars. We have Kyle Levy has asked, did Marlon Haley continue to live in the area after resigning from the EBRPD board in 1974? Also, when did he pass away?
Yeah, Marlon always lived in the area. He lived just outside of Castro Valley in what's called the Hayward Homestead Union. There's a just south of make sure I get this straight here. It's just to the west of Hayward and just south of Castro Valley. There's a neighborhood down there that was actually the first suburban subdivision in all of Castro's Rancho. It was subdivided as a suburban neighborhood in 1869, believe it or not. Wasn't very successful, but it was subdivided into little bitty lots for suburban homes in 1869. And Haley built his house down there. He lived in Hayward before that, and in the 50s he built his house there just outside of Hayward, just outside of Castro Valley. and he lived there his whole life. And I believe, I'd have to check to be sure, but I believe he died in 1994. Yeah, he was extremely influential, and if you look in the name index in the back of my book, he's referenced many times in many different contexts. For example, Cal State East Bay, they wanted to build that in the flatlands of Hayward, but due to a lot of things, but ultimately due to the lawyering of Marlon Haley, they forced them to build it on the hilltop. And so Cal State East Bay is on the hilltop rather than the flatlands, in large part because of the lawyering activities of Marlon Haley. He also built other neighborhoods in Castro Valley too. I found at least 4 tracts of homes he built in Castro Valley. 2 of them were more or less contiguous to the northeast of my tract, and then one of them was completely separate down along Grove Way in more southern Castro Valley.
Looks like Tyler Dragoni would like to say, please describe the water situation that was needed for these orchards of the area.
Yeah, so it's a good question. Water was always a limiting factor in Castro Valley. Up until, well, with few exceptions, everybody existed with well water until 1931. There were some exceptions in what's called the Knox Tract, which is the very, very, very southern tip of Castro Valley, just before you get to the San Lorenzo Creek and Hayward. They were supplied with piped water, groundwater, but piped, starting in 1892 or 1893. So those houses, which were a few houses down there, were provided with piped water. And then for a little while, a guy ran a fellow by the name of William Van Hooser, ran a piped water system to 18 farms in northeastern Castro Valley. But he shut his operation down somewhere around 1912, which definitely ticked off the Railroad Commission, which was then regulating utilities. But in any case, he stopped supplying water. So from that point on, virtually everybody except for the Knox Tract folks got their water from groundwater. Castro Valley was the first extension for EdMUD. So EdMUD came into existence in 1923, serving San Leandro, Piedmont, Emeraldville, Berkeley, and Oakland. And it was extended in 1931 to Castro Valley. They've now extended dozens of times, but the very first extension was to Castro Valley in 1931. A difficult process that required 5 steps, but they pulled it off, and then everybody had piped water after that.
Christine wants to expand. Can you tell us anything about the history of the water tower of Roby Drive?
What's the name of the road?
Robey Drive. Robbie Road? Robbie Drive? Excuse me.
Does not ring a bell. So I mean, maybe not sure. Is that? I know of 2 water towers left in Greater Castro Valley, water tank houses. I don't know of any water towers. I don't know off the top of my head. I can look it up on the map of where Roby Drive is, but I don't know if I can answer that question.
David Duncan, I've always heard that eucalyptus trees were planted in Castro Valley and the surrounding areas for logging purposes. Do you know if that's true?
Yeah, that's absolutely true. One of the great purveyors of eucalyptus trees never lived in Castro Valley, but he owned several hundred acres. Well, actually, he was one of the biggest landowners around here for a while. Gosh, I forget his name off the top of my head, but I can grab the book and I can look it up. So yeah, he started planting eucalyptus trees in Castro Valley in 1869. Okay, and this is covered in great detail in the book. And the problem was, that when the first people came to the Bay Area, they were kind of shocked by the lack of big trees that could be used for building, carriages and houses and ships. Everything was built out of wood in those days, but there were no big trees. A lot of the lumber had to be brought down by the railroad from the Sierras, or the redwoods, to the extent that those held out. So people started planting trees, and one of the very biggest planters was the guy whose name I can't remember. Let me grab a copy. Actually, he shows up on that 1878 map. If you can scroll back to the 1878 map, he shows up on that 1878 map that we looked at earlier. There he is, James T. Stratton. Okay, a little bit of a computer problem here. Hang on. Okay, James T. Stratton. He owned the land along Redwood Road, which you can see just below the Brickell Farm. He also owned land further out along what's now East Castro Valley Boulevard and along Jensen Road. You see where it says Gum Forest? Right along Castro Valley Boulevard and Redwood Road, it says Gum Forest. And then if you go straight to the right there, you'll see J.T. Stratton again, and it says Gum Forest. He wasn't the only person who planted eucalyptus trees in Castro Valley. There were others, but he was the most famous. He actually won an award for it. So he planted a couple of hundred acres of trees, which never really turned out to be useful. There were other people like Oakland, Berkeley. There were other guys that planted trees up there, but they never came in to make anybody any money, it turned out in the long run.
Just returning to the water tower question, Christiane actually expanded. She said it's near President's Drive.
Let me go out here and take a look on Google. Come on. Computer is not moving quick today. What was the name of the road again? R-O-B-Y?
R-O-B-E-Y. And it's Drive, Robbie Drive.
Let's see if we can find it. Yeah, it's moving very slowly. Maybe because we're using a lot of bandwidth. I don't know.
Maybe, yeah.
Don't know that it's going to come up. While we're waiting, is there another question? If it comes up, we can come back to that one.
He said, this may not be a fair question for now. I realize it's in part of Castro Valley where students had to go to San Lorenzo, not Castro Valley proper.
Well, I still might know something about it, but it literally will not load. I guess it's a bandwidth issue, but let's try this. It's trying again. Well, I don't know if I'm going to be able to answer that. I'll leave the window open, and if it comes up, we can come back to it.
Let's see. So, we have an anonymous attendee who said that you referenced speaking at the Castro Valley Library on the 30th of July. Will that be recorded, or would you have to be there?
I've asked the library that question. I haven't heard an answer back yet. I don't know if they have a mechanism for recording or not. I know that things have been recorded at the library in the past, but I haven't heard back on that yet. So I can't answer that question either. See my map coming up. Oh, my map might work now. Let's see. No, not really. Yeah, so it's 2 to 4 on July 30th, and if it's possible to videotape it, I will do that.
Also, they're asking, do you know anything about the town of Redwood?
Town of Redwood. So the town of Redwood was up, in the hills north of Castro Valley, and they had their own school. They had a school that serviced them that was considered kind of ancillary part of Castro Valley. But I didn't really research that area in particular, no.
Bill, Ellen just wanted to be reminded of what the topic will be at the Castro Valley Library.
Well, to be honest with you, the topic is only half set, but the half that is set is going to be a deep dive on that period of 1797 to 1863, where we'll go through all the nitty-gritty details of the transition from Native American land to the mission, to government land, and then ultimately ended up in the hands of Saxon Atherton. So half of that presentation will go through that in detail. The other half will probably cover other aspects of Castro Valley history, which I haven't chiseled in stone yet.
Looks like Tyler was just mentioning to Christiane that the East Bay Mud El Porto Reservoir is located at President's Drive in Roby. So hopefully that will help answer.
Oh, okay. Now I know what you're talking about there.
Yeah.
Yeah. So and just now my map comes up too. Roby Drive. There it is. Yeah. Well, that's an interesting thing. Actually, the reservoir is on. Yeah, it's on Roby Drive and President Drive. So, Ed Mud was created in 1923 by a vote of the people. The privately owned water districts that had been providing water didn't have the wherewithal to do what was necessary to get water from the Sierras. And so the urban areas along the coast voted to create Ed Mud with the primary goal of bringing in water from the Sierras. Now, of course, LA and San Francisco had already been working on this. And the East Bay finally got the idea, well, we have to do the same thing. We have to get up into the foothills and get water from the Sierras. So the original service area was San Lorenzo, Piedmont, Emeryville, Berkeley, and Oakland. And I think their southernmost tank was that one on Roby Drive. That tank was there a long time ago, and actually, it shows up in a 1928 photograph that's in the book. So that tank was there in 1928. Not surprising. Again, Ed Mud came into existence in 1921. And that was I think the southernmost tank that Ed Mud had. And actually, a number of farms on far western Castro Valley actually got water from that tank. Not very many, but for what I was able to piece together, maybe a dozen farms in the far west of Castro Valley got water from that tank before the 1931 addition of Castro Valley to the water district. So yeah, so that tank dates to somewhere between 1923 and 1928, probably somewhere around 1925. And there's a picture of it. You can see a picture of it and the trees around it, from 1928 in a photograph in the book.
All right, it looks like that is the end of at least all of the questions, and we certainly have gone just a little bit over, which has been absolutely lovely, actually. So I guess I will go ahead and say thank you to everyone for joining us this afternoon. Rick, thank you so much for sharing all of your information, and I look forward to being able to get to the end of this. I've already started the book, and I'm enjoying it very much. So.
218,000 words. So
yes, well, I'm not that far ahead, but I'm still enjoying all of the little factoids and all of that. So thank you so much, and thank you for sharing. I hope everybody can get access to a copy if they're interested. It's definitely worth your time. So please make sure that you pick it up.
There's 5 copies at the Castro Valley Library.
That's right. That's right. All right. Well, thank you very much, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your day and have a wonderful weekend. Rick, thank you, and
thank you so much.
All right. Take care. Bye-bye.